I never thought my daughter's 30th birthday would become the day I finally understood what betrayal felt like. The Riverside Country Club sparkled with white lights and golden decorations. 200 guests filled the ballroom, laughing and celebrating Hannah's milestone. I sat at the family table, watching my little girl beam with happiness as friends and colleagues offered toasts and well wishes. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. Hannah looked stunning in her emerald dress, the same color as her mother Sarah's eyes. For a moment, I saw my wife in her smile, remembering how Sarah had dreamed of seeing our daughter grow up, get married, build a life. Sarah never got to see any of it. Cancer took her when Hannah was only 8 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, Brandon's voice cut through my memories as he stood up, champagne glass raised. My son-in-law commanded attention effortlessly. At 33, he had that polished confidence that came from never having to struggle for anything. His family owned 3 car dealerships across the state. Money had never been a concern for Brandon Mills. "I want to thank everyone for celebrating this special day with my beautiful wife," he began, his arm draped possessively around Hannah's shoulders. The crowd murmured approval. I felt proud watching them together, even though something about Brandon had always bothered me. Maybe it was how easily everything came to him. "Hannah deserves all the love and success in the world," Brandon continued, his voice growing stronger. "She's built an amazing career as a marketing director. She's the most caring person I know. And she's been incredibly patient with family members who haven't always made things easy." A few people chuckled, assuming he was making a light-hearted joke about typical family dynamics. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. Brandon's tone was changing, becoming sharper around the edges. In fact, Hannah has shown remarkable generosity towards certain family members who frankly take advantage of her kind heart. His eyes found mine across the table. The smile on his face didn't match the coldness in his stare. Some people seem to think that family means never having to contribute anything meaningful while expecting others to carry the financial burden. The laughter in the room began to fade. Guests were picking up on the tension, conversations dying as people tried to understand what was happening. Hannah looked confused, tugging gently on Brandon's sleeve. "Brandon, maybe we should," she whispered. But he ignored her. "My wife supports a grown man who refuses to work, who lives off her generosity, while contributing absolutely nothing to this family." His voice rose, carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. At 61 years old, Paul Clark sits in his dead wife's house, collecting handouts from his daughter like some kind of broke parasite. The words hit me like physical blows. 200 faces turned toward me, some shocked, others embarrassed for witnessing such a public attack. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. Hannah's mouth fell open in horror. "Brandon, stop," she hissed. But the damage was spreading through the room like spilled wine. "Someone needs to say it," Brandon declared, warming to his theme. Hannah works 60-hour weeks to support herself, her husband, and her deadbeat father, who apparently thinks being widowed 22 years ago means he never has to work again. My hands trembled as I reached for the black leather briefcase I'd placed beside my chair. Every eye in the room was on me now. Some people looked away in embarrassment. Others stared with the morbid fascination of watching a car accident. "The man hasn't held a real job in over 5 years," Brandon continued, oblivious to my movement. "He lives rent-free in a house Hannah pays the taxes on, drives a car she bought him, and honestly expects us to be grateful for the privilege of supporting his lazy lifestyle." I stood up slowly, my legs shaking slightly. The briefcase felt heavier than usual as I lifted it onto the table. The room had gone completely silent except for Brandon's voice, which seemed to echo off the walls. "So tonight, on my wife's birthday, I think it's time we acknowledged the truth about family responsibility and—" "Brandon!" My voice cut through his speech like a blade. He stopped mid-sentence, finally noticing that I was standing, that everyone's attention had shifted. The confident smile faltered on his face. I opened the briefcase with deliberate precision, my fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to use, papers that represented 5 years of careful planning and heartbreaking disappointment. "You're absolutely right," I said. my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. It's time we acknowledge the truth about family responsibility. I pulled out the first document, a legal transfer dated 5 years ago. Brandon's face went pale as recognition dawned. Hannah leaned forward, squinting at the papers in confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice growing stronger with each word, "my son-in-law just called me a broke parasite living off my daughter's generosity. He's half right about the living arrangement, but completely wrong about everything else." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the evening was about to take an unexpected turn. I could see phones being pulled out, people preparing to document whatever was about to happen. Brandon's confident demeanor was cracking. "Paul, what are you doing?" I held up the transfer document so the nearby guests could see the official seal and signatures. 5 years ago, as a wedding gift to Hannah and Brandon, I transferred ownership of every asset I owned into my daughter's name. The house Brandon claims Hannah pays taxes on. It was my house given to her as a gift. The car he says she bought me? Technically true, since she owns the bank account the money came from, but that money was originally mine. Hannah's face went white. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table like playing cards. Bank statements showing the transfer of $2.7 million in assets, property deeds for 3 rental properties downtown, stock portfolios, retirement accounts, business assets from my construction company. All of it transferred to Hannah Mills, formerly Hannah Clark, on June 15, 2019. The gasps from the crowd were audible now. Brandon was gripping his champagne glass so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "I gave her everything," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. "Every dollar I'd saved, every property I'd bought, every investment I'd made during 40 years of working construction. I wanted to ensure my daughter would never struggle the way Sarah and I did when we were young." I looked directly at Hannah, seeing my wife's eyes staring back at me with shock and dawning understanding. I kept just enough to cover my basic living expenses and transferred the rest because I trusted that my daughter would love me whether I was rich or poor. I wanted to find out if she'd care for me in my old age because I was her father, not because I had money. The silence in the room was deafening. Brandon's face had gone from pale to green. Hannah was staring at the documents with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "So, yes, Brandon is correct. I am technically living off my daughter's generosity. The generosity I gave her 5 years ago when I made her a multimillionaire and trusted that blood would be thicker than greed." I closed the briefcase with a sharp snap that seemed to echo through the ballroom. 200 people stared at me in stunned silence, finally understanding what they'd just witnessed. Brandon's public attack had just exposed him as a man who'd spent years treating his wife's father like garbage, never realizing that the broke parasite had been the source of their comfortable lifestyle all along. The expression on his face told me he was finally doing the math, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake, but the real test was just beginning. 5 years earlier, I'd sat in my attorney's office watching David Martinez review the transfer documents for the 3rd time. The papers represented everything I'd worked for since Sarah's death, every sacrifice I'd made to build something meaningful to leave behind. "Paul, I have to ask one more time," David said, removing his reading glasses and looking at me with concern. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once these transfers are complete, you'll have no legal claim to any of these assets. Hannah will own everything outright." I stared out the window at the construction site across the street, watching workers pour concrete for what would become another office building. 40 years I'd spent in construction, starting as a laborer and eventually building Clark Construction into one of the most respected firms in the county. Every callus on my hands, every aching muscle, every 14-hour day had been worth it to provide for Sarah and Hannah. "I'm sure," I told David, "Hannah's getting married in 3 weeks. I want to give her the kind of security Sarah and I never had when we were starting out." What I didn't tell David was the real reason. Hannah had been dating Brandon for 2 years, and I'd watched my daughter slowly change during that time. She'd started talking about money differently, mentioning expensive restaurants and vacations, with a casualness that worried me. She'd begun looking at my modest lifestyle with something that looked suspiciously like embarrassment. The wedding alone is costing $80,000, she'd complained the week before. Brandon's family is flying in from all over the country, and I want everything to be perfect. But Dad, your house is so outdated. What if people want to see where I grew up? Sarah's house. The house where we'd brought Hannah home as a newborn, where we'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas, where Sarah had spent her final months. Hannah was embarrassed by the place her mother had died. We could renovate, I'd suggested, but Hannah had shaken her head. It's not just the house, Dad. It's everything. Your truck is 15 years old. Your clothes look like they're from the 80s. Brandon's family is going to think we're poor. Brandon's family. Everything had become about Brandon's family and their expectations. The Mills family owned successful businesses, drove luxury cars, took European vacations. They represented everything Hannah thought she wanted. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 5 years. I would give Hannah everything, but I would do it quietly. I would test whether her love for her father was conditional on his bank account. I hoped desperately that she would prove me wrong. The transfers are complete, David announced, stamping the final documents. As of today, Hannah Mills owns $2.7 million in assets, including your house, the rental properties, and all investment accounts. I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the financial pressure was gone. Heavier because I just bet everything on my daughter's character. The wedding was beautiful. Hannah glowed in her designer dress. Brandon looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, and I danced with my daughter to the same song Sarah and I had chosen for our wedding 30 years earlier. When Hannah hugged me that night, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Daddy," I thought maybe I'd been wrong to worry. The changes started small. 3 months after the wedding, Hannah mentioned that the property taxes on her house were higher than expected. She didn't ask me to pay them, but her tone suggested it was an inconvenience she hadn't anticipated. 6 months later, she started talking about how much money I must be saving by living in a house without a mortgage payment. When I offered to pay rent, she laughed and said that wasn't necessary, but I noticed she didn't refuse the idea entirely. By the end of the first year, Brandon had begun making comments about family finances and everyone contributing their fair share. I was still working part-time construction jobs, maintaining equipment for my old company, but Brandon seemed to think I was retired and living off their generosity. "Your dad's got it pretty good," I overheard him tell Hannah one evening when they thought I was in the garage. "No mortgage, no major expenses, just collecting Social Security and enjoying the good life." Hannah's response chilled me to the bone. I know sometimes I wonder what he does with his time all day. At least when Mom was alive, he had someone to take care of. Now it's like he's just waiting around for us to visit. Just waiting around. Sarah's husband of 18 years, Hannah's father, who'd raised her alone from age 8, reduced to someone who was just waiting around. The second year brought more pointed conversations about my contribution to household expenses. Hannah started mentioning utility bills and maintenance costs with increasing frequency. When the roof needed repairs, she sighed dramatically about the expense of keeping up this old house. "Dad, I hate to bring this up, but the heating bill was $300 last month," she said during one particularly painful conversation. "I know you keep the house warm, but maybe we could look at some energy-saving options?" I offered to pay the heating bill, but Hannah insisted that wasn't the point. The point, apparently, was that I should be more conscious of the financial impact my presence was having on their lives. By the third year, Brandon had become openly resentful of what he perceived as my freeloading lifestyle. He made comments about multi-generational households and everyone pulling their weight. He started suggesting that I might be happier in a senior living community where I could socialize with people my own age. "Your dad's a good man," he told Hannah, within my hearing, "but he's getting to the age where he might need more structure in his life. There are some really nice places that specialize in active seniors. He might make some friends." Friends. As if I didn't have friends. As if the man who'd built half the commercial buildings in town couldn't find people to talk to. The fourth year brought the conversations I'd been dreading. Hannah started talking about long-term planning and making sure everyone's needs are met. She researched assisted living facilities with the same enthusiasm she'd once shown for planning her wedding. "Dad, we found this amazing place called Golden Years Manor," she announced one Sunday dinner. "It's not a nursing home or anything depressing like that. It's more like a country club for seniors. They have activities, organized trips, even a golf course." I'd driven past Golden Years Manor. It was expensive, exclusive, and completely unnecessary for a healthy 60-year-old man who could still work a construction site better than most men half his age. "I'm not ready for that, honey," I said quietly. Brandon's response was immediate. "Paul, you have to think about Hannah's needs too. She worries about you being alone in this big house. What if you fell? What if there was an emergency? What if I became inconvenient?" That was the real question, though nobody wanted to say it out loud. By the 5th year, the year leading up to Hannah's 30th birthday, the conversations had become demands disguised as concerns. Brandon talked constantly about optimizing our resources and making smart decisions about the future. "Your father's house is worth at least $400,000, he told Hannah during a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. "If we sold it and moved him into Golden Years, we could invest that money for our kids' college funds." Our kids. They'd been trying to have children for 3 years without success, but Brandon was already spending money that didn't exist on hypothetical grandchildren while planning to dispose of the grandfather who'd made it all possible. That's when I knew the test was over. My daughter had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The woman I'd raised to be kind and grateful had become someone who saw her father as a financial burden to be managed and eventually relocated. The night before her birthday party, I'd sat in Sarah's chair in our living room, surrounded by the memories of our life together, and made my final decision. Tomorrow I would reveal the truth. I would show Hannah and Brandon exactly what kind of people they'd become. But first, I had to prepare for the possibility that my daughter would hate me for what I was about to do. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to David Martinez's contact information. Tomorrow after the party, I would be calling my attorney to discuss the legal options for undoing the biggest mistake of my life. But tonight, I would sit in my dead wife's house that my ungrateful daughter owned and remember what it felt like to believe in family loyalty. Tomorrow would change everything. The morning after Hannah's birthday party, I woke up in the same bedroom I'd shared with Sarah for 18 years. The silence felt different now, heavier. Everything had changed in the space of 10 minutes at the Riverside Country Club, but the house remained exactly the same. Sarah's jewelry box still sat on the dresser. Her favorite coffee mug still hung in the kitchen cabinet. My phone had been ringing since 6 in the morning. 12 missed calls from Hannah, 7 from Brandon, and at least 20 text messages that I hadn't bothered to read. I made coffee using Sarah's mug, a small act of defiance that felt appropriate for the morning after I'd blown up my daughter's world. The doorbell rang at 8:15. Through the living room window, I could see Hannah's BMW in the driveway, the car I'd technically bought her with money that used to be mine. She was pacing on the front porch, her face blotchy from crying. Brandon sat in the passenger seat, his phone pressed to his ear, probably talking to his lawyer or his father or anyone who might help him understand the magnitude of what had happened. I opened the door before Hannah could knock again. She looked terrible, still wearing yesterday's makeup, her hair unwashed, dressed in the same clothes she'd worn home from the party. This was Hannah at her most vulnerable, the way she'd looked when she was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. "Dad, we need to talk." Her voice was hoarse from crying or yelling or both. "Come in." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room where we'd had so many conversations over the years. The room where I'd helped her with homework, where we'd watched movies together after Sarah died, where I'd given her advice about boys and college and career choices. Hannah sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Brandon remained in the car, probably too ashamed to face me directly after last night's performance. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you said last night about the money?" I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, the complete financial records spanning the 5 years since the transfer. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, tax returns, everything organized chronologically to tell the story she'd apparently forgotten, every word. I set the folder on the coffee table between us. On June 15, 2019, I transferred $2.7 million in assets to your name as a wedding gift. You've been a millionaire for 5 years, Hannah. You just didn't know it. She stared at the documents without touching them, as if they might burn her fingers. Why didn't you tell me? The question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to your child that you've been testing their character? How do you admit that you'd hoped desperately to be proven wrong about their greed? I wanted to see if you'd love me when you thought I had nothing. The words came out more harshly than I'd intended. I wanted to know if your father mattered to you more than your father's money. Hannah flinched as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair. I've always loved you. Have you? I sat down across from her, maintaining eye contact. Because for the past 5 years, you've treated me like an inconvenience at best and a burden at worst. You've complained about my expenses, suggested I move to assisted living, and allowed your husband to publicly humiliate me in front of 200 people. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. I didn't know. If I'd known about the money, that's exactly the point, Hannah. You didn't love me because of who I am. You would have loved me because of what I could give you. There's a difference. She reached for the folder with shaking hands, finally looking at the evidence of what I'd sacrificed for her happiness. The bank statements showed the systematic transfer of every asset I'd owned. The property deeds revealed that she'd been complaining about paying taxes on houses she'd owned outright for years. The rental properties downtown, she whispered, recognizing addresses from the documents. Those apartments that bring in $30,000 a month? Yours. Have been for 5 years. The rental income goes directly into your investment account, which you've apparently never bothered to monitor. Her face went pale as she did the mental calculation. $30,000 monthly, 12 months a year, 5 years. She'd been earning over $1 million in rental income alone while complaining about the cost of keeping me housed and fed. Oh God. She dropped the papers, covering her face with her hands. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. We thought you were struggling financially. We thought we were helping support you. You thought I was a broke parasite. Those were Brandon's exact words. She looked up at me with Sarah's eyes, filled with shame and desperate hope. Can you forgive me? Can we fix this? Before I could answer, car doors slammed outside. Through the window, I watched Brandon march toward the front door, his face set with determination. Behind him walked a man I didn't recognize, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. The lawyer had arrived. Brandon didn't bother knocking. He walked into my house, technically Hannah's house, with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. Paul, we need to discuss this situation like adults. Or Brandon's voice carried the artificial calm of someone barely controlling their rage. This is my attorney, Robert Steinberg. We think there might have been some misunderstanding about the financial arrangements. The lawyer stepped forward, extending his hand with professional courtesy. Mr. Clark, I specialize in elder law and family financial disputes. Based on what Brandon has told me, there may have been some irregular financial transfers that need to be reviewed. I didn't shake his hand. Instead, I gestured toward the folder Hannah was still clutching. Everything's documented and completely legal. David Martinez handled the transfers. You can call him if you have questions about the paperwork. Brandon's composure cracked slightly. Paul, you can't just drop a bombshell like that and walk away. Hannah's been supporting you for years. There has to be some legal obligation. Supporting me? I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Hannah has been living off money I gave her while complaining about the cost of letting me exist in her presence. The only person who's been supporting anyone is me, supporting both of you for 5 years. Robert Steinberg cleared his throat diplomatically. Mr. Clark, I understand there may be some family tensions, but we need to look at the practical realities. If you transferred substantial assets to your daughter and then continued to live as a dependent, there might be grounds to argue undue influence or financial exploitation. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After 40 years of honest work, after raising Hannah alone, after giving her everything I'd built, This lawyer was suggesting that I had somehow exploited my own child. Get out. My voice was quiet but deadly serious. Both of you, get out of my house. Actually, Brandon said with a smug smile, it's Hannah's house, and as her husband, I have certain rights regarding family financial decisions. Hannah looked back and forth between us, paralyzed by the escalating conflict. I could see her trying to process everything, trying to understand how we'd gone from birthday celebration to legal threats in less than 24 hours. Hannah, I said, focusing entirely on my daughter, you have a choice to make right now. You can stand by your husband who just threatened legal action against your father, or you can ask them to leave so we can work this out as family. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Hannah stared at the financial documents in her lap, then at Brandon's expectant face, then finally at me. When she looked up, I saw Sarah in her expression, the strength that had carried my wife through chemotherapy and the grace she'd shown even in her final days. Brandon, I think you should go. His face went red. Hannah, you're not thinking clearly. This man just admitted to manipulating you for 5 years. He's been playing psychological games with our marriage, with our finances, with our entire life. He's my father, Hannah said quietly, and apparently he's been supporting us without us even knowing it. I think I owe him the courtesy of a private conversation. Brandon's lawyer whispered something in his ear, probably about community property laws and spousal rights. Brandon nodded grimly, then turned back to Hannah with the look of a man playing his final card. Fine, but Hannah, remember that everything you own is technically half mine under state law. If your father tries to take back what he gave you, he'll be taking it from both of us, and I won't let that happen without a fight. The threat hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything we'd built as a family. Hannah clutched the financial documents tighter, finally understanding that the money she'd never known she had was about to become the battlefield for a war nobody wanted to fight. After Brandon and his lawyer left, Hannah and I sat in silence for several minutes. The house felt different, with just the two of us, the way it had during those first years after Sarah died, when we'd learned to take care of each other. Dad, Hannah said finally, I know I've been awful to you. I know I failed some kind of test I didn't even know I was taking, but please tell me it's not too late to make this right. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. Under the expensive clothes and professional makeup, I could still see the 8-year-old who'd climbed into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when her mother couldn't come to school plays, who'd promised me she'd never forget how hard we'd worked to build our life together. That depends, I said quietly, on whether you're willing to remember who you were before you became who you think you need to be. The next few hours would determine whether I'd saved my daughter or lost her forever. 2 days after the birthday party disaster, Hannah called me at 6 in the morning. Her voice was shaky, barely controlled panic threading through every word. Dad, I need to see you. Alone. I found something. She arrived within the hour, clutching a manila folder and looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing an old sweater I recognized from her college years. This was Hannah, stripped of all pretense, raw and frightened. I spent yesterday going through our financial records, she said, settling into Sarah's favorite chair. 5 years of bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns, everything Brandon told me we couldn't afford to organize because we were too busy supporting you. The irony in her voice was bitter. I poured 2 cups of coffee, using Sarah's mug for myself and Hannah's childhood favorite, the one with faded cartoon characters that she'd refused to throw away, even as an adult. What did you find? She opened the folder with trembling fingers. Brandon has been lying to me about everything. Our finances, our expenses, even basic things like grocery bills and utilities. The first document she showed me was a credit card statement from 3 years ago. Brandon Mills, authorized user, charges totaling $8,000 in a single month. Expensive restaurants, golf equipment, clothing stores, I recognized as the kind that catered to men who needed to project success. He told me this was business expenses, client dinners, networking events, professional wardrobe. I never questioned it because His family always talked about the importance of maintaining appearances in the car business. I studied the charges more carefully. Most of the restaurants were in the next county, places where Brandon wouldn't be likely to run into Hannah's friends or colleagues. The clothing purchases were from stores that specialized in luxury casual wear, not business attire. "Hannah, these look like dates, expensive dates." Her face crumbled. That's what I thought too. So I called the restaurants, pretended to be planning an anniversary dinner, asked about romantic table settings and private dining areas. 3 of them remembered Brandon by name. They remembered him bringing different women over the past 2 years. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, not because I particularly liked Brandon, but because I could see how much it was destroying my daughter. Sarah had been betrayed by a boyfriend before we met, and I remembered how long it had taken her to trust again. "There's more," Hannah continued, pulling out bank statements. "Remember how Brandon was always complaining about money being tight? About how we needed to be more careful with expenses because we were supporting you?" The statements told a completely different story. Hannah's account, the one that received the rental income from properties she hadn't known she owned, showed regular monthly deposits of $30,000. But there were also regular withdrawals, always for amounts just under $10,000, always signed by Brandon Mills as authorized account holder. "He's been taking money from your account?" "For 3 years, nearly $200,000 total. He told me these were transfers to our joint savings account for future investments." He pulled out another statement. "The joint account has $1,700 in it." I felt anger building in my chest, the slow burn of rage that came from watching someone hurt my child. Brandon hadn't just been ungrateful for my generosity, he'd been actively stealing from Hannah while convincing her that her father was the financial burden. "Where did the money go?" Hannah's hands were shaking as she showed me the next set of documents. Bank records from an account I didn't recognize, opened in Brandon's name only with no connection to Hannah's finances. Gambling debts. The account shows regular payments to something called Pacific Casino Management. $15,000 last month alone. Another $20,000 to an outfit called Silver Creek Gaming in February. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Brandon hadn't just been living off Hannah's inherited wealth. He'd been systematically draining it to fund a gambling addiction while psychologically manipulating her into believing her father was the problem. "How much does he owe?" "I hired a private investigator yesterday." Hannah's voice was barely a whisper. "Brandon owes $430,000 to various casinos and private lenders. Some of the lenders are the kind that don't just send collection notices." My blood ran cold. "Hannah, are you safe? Are we safe?" "I don't know. The investigator says some of these debts are overdue by months. Brandon's been making minimum payments, but the interest keeps compounding. He's been promising bigger payments, apparently telling them that a family inheritance was coming through soon." The family inheritance. My death. Brandon had been planning my death as a solution to his gambling debts while publicly humiliating me as a way to justify cutting me out of Hannah's life entirely. "There's something else," Hannah said, pulling out a document that made my heart stop. "I found this in Brandon's desk drawer yesterday while he was at work. It was a life insurance application, dated 6 months ago, with my name as the insured and Hannah as the beneficiary. The coverage amount was $500,000, exactly enough to cover Brandon's gambling debts with money left over. He forged my signature. That's what it looks like. The investigator says the insurance company probably would have required a medical exam, but Brandon submitted documentation claiming you were in declining health and might not qualify for coverage much longer." I stared at the fraudulent application, trying to process the magnitude of Brandon's deception. He hadn't just been stealing from Hannah, he'd been planning to profit from my death while convincing my daughter that I was a burden on their lives. "Hannah, we need to call the police. This is insurance fraud, forgery, theft." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of her husband's betrayal became clear. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I believed everything he told me. About money being tight, about you taking advantage of us, about needing to make tough decisions about your future." I moved to sit beside her on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders, the way I had when she was 8 years old and afraid of monsters in her closet. The real monster had been sleeping in her bed for 5 years. This isn't your fault, honey. Brandon is a professional manipulator. He knew exactly how to make you doubt yourself and trust him. But I should have seen it. I should have questioned the financial stuff, should have paid more attention to where our money was coming from and where it was going. You trusted your husband. That's what marriage is supposed to be about. The front door opened before Hannah could respond. We both froze, listening to familiar footsteps in the hallway. Brandon was home early from work, probably wondering why Hannah's car was in my driveway. "Why, Hannah?" His voice carried that false cheerfulness that I now recognized as a warning sign. "Your car's here. Everything okay?" Hannah wiped her tears quickly, trying to compose herself. I could see her mind racing, trying to decide how to handle the confrontation that was about to happen. "We're in the living room," she called back, her voice surprisingly steady. Brandon appeared in the doorway, still wearing his dealership polo and khakis, looking like the successful businessman he pretended to be. His smile faltered when he saw the documents spread across the coffee table. "What's all this?" He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the bank statements and insurance papers. I watched his face change as recognition dawned, watched him realize that his carefully constructed lies were falling apart. "We know about the gambling, Brandon." Hannah's voice was ice cold. "We know about the stolen money, the forged insurance application, all of it." Brandon's mask dropped completely. The charming son-in-law disappeared, replaced by someone desperate and cornered. "Hannah, you don't understand. I can explain everything. Explain how you've been stealing from me for 3 years while telling me we couldn't afford to help my father? It's not stealing. We're married. What's yours is mine, legally speaking." The casual admission sent another wave of rage through me. Brandon wasn't even pretending to be sorry. He was defending his right to steal from his wife. "What about the life insurance fraud?" I asked quietly. "Is that legally mine too?" Brandon's eyes darted toward the door, calculating distances and escape routes. "That was just a precaution. Estate planning. Every family should have adequate life insurance coverage. With forged signatures and false medical information? I was protecting Hannah's interests, making sure she'd be financially secure if something happened to you." The lie was so brazen, so completely divorced from reality, that Hannah actually laughed, a bitter, broken sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "Protecting me? You've been planning to cash in on my father's death to pay your gambling debts." Brandon's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. These people don't just send collection notices, Hannah. They make threats, real threats. I needed options." "So you decided my father's death was an option?" "He's 61 years old. He's lived his life. You and I are just starting ours." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Hannah stared at her husband with undisguised horror, finally seeing him for what he really was. A man who had been willing to destroy her relationship with her father, steal her inheritance, and potentially arrange her father's death, all to cover his gambling addiction. I stood up slowly, my hands clenched into fists. "Get out of this house. Now. You can't throw me out. This is Hannah's house and I'm her husband." "Actually," Hannah said, her voice deadly quiet, "you're about to be my ex-husband. And this is my father's house, which I'm giving back to him today." Brandon's face went white as he realized the implications. No house, no wife, no access to the money he'd been stealing, just $400,000 in gambling debts and some very dangerous people who expected to be paid. "Hannah, you can't do this. Think about what we built together." "What we built?" She stood up, facing him with Sarah's strength shining in her eyes. "You built lies, Brandon. You built a life based on stealing from my father and manipulating me into hating the man who gave us everything." Brandon looked back and forth between us, apparently realizing that his charm offensive wasn't going to work this time. When he spoke again, his voice carried a threat that sent chills down my spine. "If you throw me out, if you cut me off financially, those debts don't just disappear. The people I owe money to won't care about divorce papers or property transfers. They'll come looking for payment wherever they can find it." The implication was clear. Even if Hannah divorced him, even if we exposed his fraud, we might all pay the price for his gambling addiction. Brandon had trapped us in his web of debt and deception, and he was threatening to take us down with him. But as I looked at my daughter's face, I saw something that gave me hope. Hannah wasn't backing down. For the first time in 5 years, she was choosing her father over her husband's threats and manipulation. "Then I guess we'll deal with that when it happens," she said quietly. "But I'm not living another day married to a man who tried to profit from my father's death." The war was just beginning, but for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't fighting alone. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole situation. Brandon was contesting everything: the asset transfers, Hannah's right to recover stolen money, even her decision to file for divorce. His attorney, Robert Steinberg, had crafted a narrative that painted me as a manipulative elder who had used undue influence to control my daughter's finances. I sat at my kitchen table, reading through the legal documents while Hannah paced back and forth, her anger growing with each ridiculous claim. According to Brandon's version of events, I had deliberately transferred my assets to Hannah as part of an elaborate scheme to maintain control over her while avoiding my own financial responsibilities. "He's claiming you manipulated me into believing I was poor so you could live off my gratitude," Hannah said, her voice tight with fury. "He's saying the whole thing was psychological abuse designed to make me financially dependent on your approval." The accusation was so twisted, so completely backward, that I almost had to admire Brandon's creativity. He was taking the truth and flipping it entirely, making himself the victim, and me, the villain. "There's more," Hannah continued, pulling out another document. "He's requesting a full forensic accounting of all our assets going back 10 years. He wants half of everything, including the properties you gave me before we were married." I looked up from the legal papers, studying my daughter's face. The past week had aged her years. Dark circles under her eyes spoke to sleepless nights spent wondering how she'd missed the signs of Brandon's deception. But there was something else there too, a determination I hadn't seen since she was a child, the same fierce stubbornness that had helped her survive her mother's death. "Hannah, are you sure you want to fight this? Brandon's right about one thing. Divorce can get ugly, especially when there's this much money involved." She stopped pacing and looked at me with Sarah's eyes, filled with a resolve that made me proud. "Dad, that man spent 3 years stealing from me while convincing me you were a burden. He forged your signature on life insurance papers. He was planning to profit from your death. I don't care how ugly this gets." Before I could respond, my phone rang. David Martinez, my attorney, calling with news I'd been dreading. "Paul, we have a problem. Brandon's legal team has filed a motion claiming that your original asset transfer was made under duress. They're alleging that you were suffering from early-stage dementia and that Hannah took advantage of your condition to gain control of your finances." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "David, that's completely false. You handled the transfer yourself. You know my mental state was perfectly clear. I know that, and my records will support it. But Brandon's team has found a doctor willing to testify that the behavior patterns Hannah described, your recent isolation, your apparent financial dependence, your emotional volatility, could be consistent with cognitive decline." I felt the room spinning slightly. Brandon wasn't just trying to steal Hannah's money. He was trying to destroy my reputation, paint me as an elderly man who'd lost his mental faculties and manipulated his own daughter. "There's something else," David continued. "The insurance company has filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office. The forged application triggered an investigation into elder fraud. Brandon is claiming that you were involved in the fraud, that you knew about the application, and approved it as part of your manipulative control over Hannah's finances." Hannah grabbed the phone from my hands. "David, this is Hannah. Can they really make these charges stick? Can they actually convince people that my father is the villain here?" "Hannah, I won't lie to you. Brandon's strategy is clever. He's taking every piece of evidence that shows Paul's generosity and reframing it as manipulation. The fact that Paul tested your character by not telling you about the money transfer could be portrayed as psychological abuse. The fact that you've been supporting him financially, even unknowingly, could be seen as elder financial exploitation. I sank into my chair, feeling the weight of Brandon's strategy crushing down on me. He was turning my love for Hannah into evidence of my guilt, twisting my sacrifices into proof of my manipulative nature. But here's what Brandon doesn't know, David continued, his voice brightening slightly. I've been doing some investigating of my own, and I found something that's going to blow his case apart. Hannah and I exchanged glances, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time in days. What did you find? Bank records showing that Brandon has been systematically stealing from Hannah for over 3 years. But more importantly, I found communication records between Brandon and his gambling contacts. Text messages, emails, phone records. And Paul, you're going to love this. Brandon has been bragging to his gambling buddies about his plan to inherit his wife's money by getting rid of her inconvenient father. The blood rushed to my head as the implications sank in. He put it in writing? Text messages to a casino contact named Jimmy Torino. Quote, "The old man won't be a problem much longer. Hannah doesn't even know she's rich. Once I handle the father situation, we'll have access to everything." End quote. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, he was actually planning to hurt you. There's more. Phone records show Brandon called Jimmy Torino the day after your birthday party, Paul. 37-minute conversation. Then he called a contact listed as Tony Collections and talked for over an hour. I think Brandon was getting pressure to pay up. And your public revelation ruined his timeline. I felt pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Brandon's gambling debts weren't just overdue, they were probably being enforced by people who didn't care about legal niceties. When I'd exposed the truth at Hannah's party, I'd destroyed Brandon's ability to quietly eliminate me and claim Hannah's inheritance. So now he's desperate, I said, understanding the full scope of what we were facing. He can't get to the money through Hannah anymore, so he's trying to get it through the courts while destroying my credibility. Exactly. But Paul, his desperation is going to be his downfall. The communication records prove premeditation, the financial records prove theft, and the insurance fraud proves intent to profit from your death. Brandon isn't just facing divorce, he's facing criminal charges. Hannah was crying now, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. Can we stop his legal action? Better than that, we can turn it around on him. I'm filing a motion tomorrow requesting a restraining order against Brandon based on credible threats to Paul's safety. The text messages and phone records will be Exhibit A. After David hung up, Hannah and I sat in silence for several minutes. The kitchen felt different, somehow lighter, despite the legal battle ahead. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had evidence that would prove Brandon's true nature to the world. Dad, Hannah said quietly, I need to tell you something. About the past 5 years, about how I treated you. I reached across the table and took her hand, the same small hand I'd held when she was 8 years old and afraid of losing another parent. Hannah, you don't need to. Yes, I do, because Brandon didn't make me treat you badly. He just gave me permission to act on feelings I was already having. The admission hung between us like a bridge we both needed to cross. I was angry at you, Dad. Angry that Mom died and left me with just you. Angry that you never remarried, never gave me a normal family again. Angry that you worked so much when I was growing up, that you missed school events and parent conferences because you were always at some construction site. Her words stung because they contained truth. I had worked too much after Sarah died. I had missed events. I had been so focused on providing financial security that I'd sometimes neglected emotional support. When I met Brandon, his family represented everything I thought I'd missed. 2 parents, financial stability, social connections. I wanted that life so badly that I started seeing you as an obstacle to it. I squeezed her hand gently. You were grieving, Hannah. You lost your mother when you were 8. It's natural that you'd want what other families had. But that doesn't excuse how I treated you. Brandon made it easy to blame you for things that weren't your fault, but I chose to believe him. I chose to see you as a burden, instead of recognizing the sacrifices you made. She pulled out another document from her folder, something I hadn't seen before. It was a handwritten letter, several pages long, written in Hannah's careful script. I wrote this last night, after I found all the evidence about Brandon's gambling and theft. I wanted to remember everything I'd said to you over the past 5 years, every cruel comment, every time I made you feel unwanted. I started to protest, but Hannah held up her hand. I need you to hear this, because I need you to know that I remember now. I remember who you were before Brandon started poisoning my thoughts against you. She began reading from the letter, her voice shaking with emotion. I remember that you worked 3 jobs after Mom died to keep me in the same school district. I remember that you learned to braid my hair by watching YouTube videos. I remember that you came to every single softball game, even when you were so tired you could barely stand. The memories washed over me like warm rain. Hannah at 10, proudly showing me her science project. Hannah at 13, crying over her first heartbreak while I held her and promised that someday she'd find someone who deserved her. Hannah at 18, graduating valedictorian and thanking me in her speech for never giving up on her dreams. I remember that you gave up dating for 10 years because you thought it might confuse me or make me feel like you were trying to replace Mom. I remember that you kept every single drawing I made, every report card, every photo from every school dance. She was crying freely now, years of suppressed guilt and gratitude flowing out in waves. Most of all, I remember that when I told you I was marrying Brandon, you smiled and hugged me and promised to give us the most beautiful wedding possible, even though I could see in your eyes that you had doubts about him. I thought about that conversation 3 weeks before the wedding when Hannah had been so excited about her future with Brandon. I'd seen the red flags even then, his casual attitude toward money, his dismissive comments about old-fashioned values, his assumption that Hannah's family assets would naturally become his to manage. I should have listened to you, Hannah continued, but I was so afraid of becoming like you, working all the time, sacrificing everything for other people, never having the kind of comfortable life that Brandon's family represented. Hannah, there's nothing wrong with wanting a comfortable life, but there's something wrong with getting it by betraying the people who love you most. And that's what I did, Dad. I betrayed you. Not just by believing Brandon's lies, but by wanting to believe them because they made my choices easier. The honesty in her voice, the complete absence of self-pity or excuses, told me that my daughter had finally grown into the woman Sarah and I had hoped she'd become. It had taken a devastating betrayal and the near loss of everything she valued to get there, but Hannah had found her way back to the values we'd tried to instill in her. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I stood up and walked around the table, pulling her into the kind of hug I'd given her as a child, when simple physical comfort could heal almost any hurt. "There's nothing to forgive, honey. You're my daughter. You're Sarah's daughter. And you're exactly who you're supposed to be." As I held her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years. Hope. Not just hope that we could repair our relationship, but hope that the test I'd designed to measure her character had finally produced the result I'd always prayed for. Tomorrow, we would face Brandon's legal assault together. Tomorrow we would begin the process of undoing the damage he'd caused to our family and our finances. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, my daughter was truly home. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where Sarah and I had finalized Hannah's adoption 23 years earlier. Today's hearing would determine the final resolution of Brandon's legal challenges and his criminal charges for fraud and theft. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same building where we'd made Hannah legally our daughter was now the place where we'd sever her legal ties to the man who'd tried to destroy our family. Hannah sat beside me in the gallery, wearing a navy blue dress that reminded me of the one Sarah had worn to court all those years ago. She'd lost weight during the stress of the past months, but there was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. The ordeal with Brandon had stripped away her illusions about easy wealth and comfortable lives, leaving behind someone who understood the real value of loyalty and love. David Martinez approached our table with a folder thick with evidence. Over the past 6 months, his investigation had uncovered the full scope of Brandon's deception, reaching back far beyond the 3 years of financial theft Hannah had discovered. "Paul, Hannah, I have some final updates before we go in," David said, settling into the chair across from us. The criminal investigation has turned up additional charges. Brandon didn't just forge Paul's signature on one life insurance policy. He applied for coverage with 3 different companies, using falsified medical records to make Paul appear sicker than he actually was. Hannah's face went pale. 3 policies, totaling $1.2 million in coverage. The prosecutors believe Brandon was planning to stage Paul's death as an accident, probably a fall or a heart attack, brought on by the stress of family financial problems. The insurance payouts would have covered his gambling debts with enough left over to disappear if necessary. The casual way David delivered this information, as if we were discussing a business transaction rather than a murder plot, made the whole situation feel surreal. Brandon had been living in our house, eating dinner at our table, presenting himself as a loving son-in-law while systematically planning my death. What about his gambling debts? I asked. Are we still at risk from his creditors? That's actually worked out better than expected. The FBI investigation into Brandon's activities led them to several illegal gambling operations. Most of his creditors are now facing federal charges themselves. The few legitimate debts he had are being handled through bankruptcy proceedings that won't affect you or Hannah. Before we could respond, a commotion near the courtroom entrance caught our attention. Brandon was arriving with his legal team, flanked by 2 federal marshals. The confident businessman who'd humiliated me at Hannah's birthday party was gone, replaced by a man in an orange jumpsuit who'd aged years in the past 6 months. His eyes found mine across the courtroom, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret. Then his gaze shifted to Hannah, and the regret transformed into bitter resentment. Even now, facing prison time for fraud and attempted murder, Brandon apparently blamed us for his downfall. The plea negotiations fell through yesterday, David explained quietly. Brandon's attorney wanted a deal that would allow him to serve his sentence in minimum security, maybe 18 months total. The prosecutors refused. With the additional insurance fraud charges and the evidence of premeditated planning, he's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, and the final chapter of Brandon's legal challenges began. His attorney, Robert Steinberg, had abandoned the strategy of painting me as a manipulative elder. The evidence of Brandon's crimes was too overwhelming to maintain that fiction. Instead, Steinberg focused on portraying Brandon as a man driven to desperate measures by gambling addiction, mental health issues, and financial pressures beyond his control. It was a sympathy play designed to minimize his sentence rather than prove his innocence. Your Honor, Steinberg began, my client recognizes that he made serious errors in judgment. He's prepared to accept responsibility for his actions and make full restitution to the victims. However, we ask the court to consider the underlying issues that led to these regrettable decisions. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, wasn't buying the sympathy angle. Your Honor, the defendant didn't make errors in judgment. He executed a systematic plan to defraud his wife, forge documents in his father-in-law's name, and potentially commit murder for financial gain. The evidence shows premeditation, careful planning, and complete disregard for human life. Santos presented the text messages David had discovered, conversations between Brandon and his gambling contacts that revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. Reading them aloud in court, hearing Brandon's casual discussions about eliminating the old man problem made Hannah flinch beside me. The defendant referred to Paul Clark's potential death as a timeline acceleration, Santos continued. He discussed methods for making the death appear natural while maximizing insurance payouts. This wasn't desperation. It was cold-blooded planning. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence carefully, asking pointed questions about the timeline of Brandon's crimes and the psychological evaluations that had been conducted. When she finally looked up from the documents, her expression was grim. Mr. Mills, I've reviewed the plea agreement offered by the prosecution, and I've considered your attorney's arguments for leniency. However, the evidence presented today shows a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond simple fraud or even theft. She paused, looking directly at Brandon. You didn't just steal money from your wife. You systematically manipulated her relationship with her father while planning that father's murder for financial gain. You forged official documents, committed insurance fraud across multiple states, and engaged in what can only be described as a conspiracy to commit murder. Brandon's face went white as the full weight of his situation became clear. I sentence you to 18 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 12 years. You will also pay full restitution to the victims, including all stolen funds plus interest and damages. The gavel fell with finality that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Brandon's head dropped to his hands, finally understanding that his manipulative charm couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. As the marshals led him away, Brandon looked back at Hannah one final time. I expected to see hatred or blame in his expression, but instead I saw something that looked almost like genuine remorse. Whether he was sorry for what he'd done or just sorry he'd been caught, I'd never know. Outside the courthouse, Hannah and I stood on the steps breathing the crisp autumn air. 6 months of legal battles, investigations, and emotional turmoil were finally over. Brandon was gone, his debts were resolved, and our family could begin the process of healing. "It's really over," Hannah said, more to herself than to me. "The legal part is over. But Hannah, we still have work to do on us." "Oi, boss." She turned to look at me, Sarah's eyes filled with understanding. "You're talking about the money, about what happens to everything now." I pulled out a document David had prepared, the final piece of business we needed to resolve. "I'm officially transferring ownership of all the properties back to your name, but with conditions this time. Legal protections that will prevent anyone from manipulating you or stealing from you again." Hannah shook her head. "Dad, I don't want it. I don't want any of it. The past 6 months have taught me that having money I didn't earn just makes me a target for people like Brandon. The money isn't the problem, honey. The problem was not understanding where it came from or what it represented." I showed her the trust documents David had prepared, a structure that would protect the assets while ensuring they were used responsibly. "This isn't about making you rich, Hannah. It's about making sure you're secure. The rental income will cover your living expenses so you can choose work you love rather than work you need. The principal will be there for emergencies, for your future children's education, for opportunities that matter to you." She studied the documents carefully, and I could see her processing not just the financial implications, but the emotional ones. This money represented 40 years of my work, 22 years of Sarah's sacrifices, and our combined dreams for our daughter's future. "There's one more condition," I continued. "I want to be involved in the major decisions, not as a controlling parent, but as a partner in managing what we built together. I want us to talk about investments, about philanthropy, about using this wealth to make a difference." Hannah smiled for the first time in months, a genuine expression of joy that reminded me of the little girl who used to help me rake leaves in our backyard. "I'd like that, Dad. I want to learn from you instead of just inheriting from you." 3 months later, Hannah moved back into the house where she'd grown up, not as a dependent daughter, but as a co-owner working alongside her father to manage our family's legacy. She'd taken a new job with a nonprofit organization, using her marketing skills to help other families dealing with elder fraud and financial abuse. The rental properties became part of a larger mission to provide affordable housing for seniors and young families. The investment portfolios were restructured to support companies that aligned with our values. The money that Brandon had seen as an opportunity for quick gratification became a tool for long-term positive impact. One evening, as Hannah and I sat in the living room reviewing investment reports, she looked up from her laptop with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, do you think Brandon ever really loved me? Or was it always about the money?" It was a question she'd been avoiding for months, afraid of the answer, but needing to know. "I think Brandon loved the idea of you," I said carefully. "He loved having a beautiful, successful wife. He loved the social status and the financial security, but I don't think he ever understood who you really are." She nodded slowly, processing this. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you'd never told me about the money transfer, if you just let me keep believing we were struggling financially." You'd have eventually figured out that something didn't add up. And Brandon's gambling debts would have caught up with him eventually. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone is living a lie as big as Brandon was. But you took such a risk, testing me the way you did. What if I'd never figured it out? What if I'd chosen Brandon over you permanently? I thought about that question, the fear that had kept me awake many nights over the past 5 years. Then I would have known that I'd failed as a father, not because you made the wrong choice, but because I hadn't raised you to recognize the right one. Hannah closed her laptop and came to sit beside me on the couch, the same spot where we'd had so many important conversations over the years. You didn't fail, Dad. It just took me longer to remember the lessons you'd taught me. As I held my daughter close, I thought about Sarah and wondered if she would approve of how everything had turned out. The test I'd designed had been cruel in its way, forcing Hannah to choose between comfort and character. But it had also been necessary, revealing truths that needed to be exposed before they destroyed our family entirely. Brandon was serving his sentence in federal prison, his gambling addiction being treated alongside his other psychological issues. Hannah had filed for divorce within a week of his sentencing, and the legal dissolution of their marriage had been completed without contest. The money that had caused so much pain and manipulation was now being used to build something positive. Hannah had found her purpose in helping other families avoid the kind of deception we'd experienced. And I had found something I'd lost 5 years earlier: absolute confidence in my daughter's character and love. The test was over. We had both passed, though not in the way I'd originally expected. Hannah had learned that wealth without wisdom is dangerous. I had learned that love without trust is meaningless. And together, we had discovered that family loyalty isn't automatic. It has to be earned and re-earned through a lifetime of choices. As autumn turned to winter, Hannah and I settled into our new routine of shared responsibility and mutual respect. The house felt alive again, filled with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from meaningful work and honest relationships. Sometimes, in the evenings when we were reviewing foundation proposals or discussing investment strategies, I would catch glimpses of Sarah in Hannah's profile, in the determined set of her jaw when she was concentrating, in the gentle way she handled difficult decisions. Sarah would be proud of the woman our daughter had become, not because of the money she'd inherited, but because of the character she'd reclaimed. Not because she'd chosen her father over her husband, but because she'd chosen truth over comfortable lies. The final test had revealed that love, real love, isn't about what someone can give you. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to protect what matters most. Hannah had been willing to sacrifice her marriage, her social status, and her financial security to stand by the truth and defend her father. In return, I had given her something more valuable than money: the knowledge that she was capable of making difficult choices based on principle rather than convenience. That knowledge would serve her well for the rest of her life, long after the inheritance was spent and the legal battles were forgotten. The broke parasite Brandon had described at Hannah's birthday party had turned out to be a millionaire with principles. The generous father he'd tried to destroy had emerged stronger, with his daughter's respect fully restored and their family bond stronger than ever. Justice had been served, not just in the courthouse, but in the quiet redemption of a relationship that had seemed lost forever. And in the end, that was worth more than all the money in the world.